Well, hi, my name is Pat Salmon. I'm a historian and author here on Staten Island. I'm here at the Noble Maritime Collection today to discuss maritime mishaps that have occurred around Staten Island, and there have been quite a few. We go back to 1852, to where we begin with a place that was then called the Vanderbilt Landing. Today, we would call it Clifton. The Vanderbilt Landing was located near Bay Street and Vanderbilt Avenue. It was a landing for ferries that were operated by the Vanderbilt family. On July 5th, 1852, a ferry bridge actually collapsed at the Vanderbilt Landing. You see, passengers were departing a ferry boat called the Hunchback, and they were mingling with people who were actually getting on the ferry boat. So everybody's getting on the boat and off the boat at the same time. There were about 1,500 people already on the Hunchback, and there were another 800 people on the landing that were trying to get on the boat. So as you can well imagine, this was far too many people, especially when you throw in the horses and the carriages that were also trying to get on and off the boat. Catastrophically, there was so much weight on the ferry bridge that it collapsed, and it sent people and horses and carriages into the water. Dozens of men, women, and children and horses all fell in at the same time. Unfortunately, the weight of the bodies on top even prevented some of the bodies below them to come to the top. So altogether, about 200 people fell into the water when the bridge collapsed. 12 bodies were recovered within 48 hours of the tragedy, and more were expected as crews continued to search for human remains. At least 17 individuals who drowned were recovered in the long run. Now, most of the people who were getting on or off the boat were actually German immigrants. There were many Germans on Staten Island. There were many Germans in Manhattan. And so they would actually come to Staten Island or gather on Staten Island for, summertime activities. They would gather together. They might go to the beer gardens that were located at the active breweries. They were very involved with gymnastics. So they would have gymnastic competitions or shooting competitions. Many of the people who were actually on the scene, who were getting on or off the boat, complained that the chains that were holding the bridge together were not sufficient. They were not sufficient to hold the number of people and horses that were getting on and off the bridge. Now, the Vanderbilt family that we know, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jacob Vanderbilt, they operated the ferry that went back and forth from this landing. So they were actually responsible for the landing bridge. So they were indicted with manslaughter. But the Vanderbilts were unconcerned, and it was actually with good reason, because on February 26th, 1853, it was announced that the indictment against them was actually quashed. In other words, it was legally voided. No one was ever held accountable. We also remember July 30th, 1871. This was the date that the Westfield, it was a horrendous boiler explosion occurred on this ferry boat. There were 400 passengers on board the Westfield at this time. The people were catapulted in all directions. Some people were said to have gone as high as 30 feet into the air. The boat was berthed at the end of Whitehall Street in Manhattan, the places we know today where the ferry boats land. Well, when the boiler exploded, the ship was torn asunder, with the escaping boiler steam scalding many of the individuals who might have otherwise been saved. Approximately 200 people were seriously injured, and 50 or more were killed at the time of the accident. Strangely enough, and fortunately, the ferry boat was able to be rebuilt, and it was used for many, many years thereafter. Now, the Westfield ferry boat was part of the East Shore Line, and because of the accident, the East Shore Line was soon brought to foreclosure owing to the liability that was incurred by the explosion. As we said, eventually the boat was put back into service, but years later, one retired ferry boat captain named Johnny Hamill would say of the rebuilt Westfield, quote, "I sailed on the Westfield many, many times, but I never did care for her greatly. A death boat has a dislikable feeling. It gave me a fearsome uneasiness, a chill of the spirit." When the city eventually took over Staten Island ferry service in 1905, the Westfield was still in service at that time. But it's believed that about 7 years later, the Westfield finally went out of service. Now, one of the major problems with ferry boats is weather. One of the most severe weather situations that we know of was the blizzard of 1888. It started with rain on March 11th. By the following day, a violent snowstorm was burying the city and the surrounding area. Now, the snowstorm and the accompanying high winds would actually go on for another 3 days until March 14th. Now, I found conflicting reports about Staten Island ferry boat service during the blizzard of 1888, but I did find an account from a Captain Henry Cattermole, who took it upon himself to drive the ferry boat Westfield again from Staten Island to Whitehall in the midst of this storm. Now, as you know, the ferry ride takes about 22 to 25 minutes today. And believe it or not, even back in the 1880s, it took 22 to 25 minutes back at that time, too. Well, it took Captain Cattermole almost 11 hours to go across the New York harbor that day. He wasn't thrilled with traversing the harbor in the middle of a blizzard, but there was a group of people who wanted to get back home and get back to their own houses while the storm was going on. So the captain said, "Sure, get aboard." Just so you know, Captain Henry Cattermole, survivor and conqueror of the blizzard of '88, is currently a resident of Moravian Cemetery. Not that anything happened to him, because he was successful in getting those people back to Manhattan. Another challenging situation for ferry boats is the presence of fog. Now, there was another captain whose name was Captain Peter Murley, and he traveled the New York harbor for well over 50 years. In 1958, the captain vividly described how in the absence of radar, he used sound to feel his way through the harbor. And it was a much busier harbor prior to 1950. According to Captain Murley, it was a piece of cake. To quote him, he said, "Fog or no fog, everyone's roaring around like they're in a regatta. They forget radar can break down, or it can be red roll. The Andrea Dory's on the bottom, isn't she? Sure, I always put a man on the radar just to be extra careful, but I have a lot more faith in the compass and the echo of a whistle. Take, for instance, when you're coming out of Whitehall on a foggy night, you go at tender at slow speed on a course of 180 degrees for 30 seconds. Then you swing 260 degrees and you switch to half speed. After that, you give the whistle a couple of short, sharp blasts, and each of them brings in an echo from Castle William on Governor's Island. From experience, you can tell about where you're running by the strength of the rebounds and the length of time it comes into the boat." Now, I mean, this is completely amazing. He used to say, no matter how bad the weather is outside, it's important to keep all of the windows on the boat open in the pilot house so you can tell what direction the echoes are coming in from. So he's hearing and feeling things. He's not so much dependent on the radar. Another thing he used to say was, "I just stick my hand out one of the forward windows. If your hand is good and warm, it's easy to tell what side of the boat is getting the most breeze." How do you like that? Well, another big maritime catastrophe that occurred in Staten Island history was the sinking of the Northfield. Now, a number of factors contributed to the takeover of Staten Island ferry service by the city of New York. There were many complaints from the passengers who had to ride the boats. There were many complaints about it's late, it's dirty, they're breaking down. The Staten Island Chamber of Commerce complained it's inadequate boats, inadequate service. So there was a public outcry. And the final factor was the sinking of the Northfield in 1901. Now, the Northfield was built in 1862. It was not an uncommon occurrence back in those days for latecomers to actually jump for the boat as it was departing the dock. The men's smoking cabin on that ship was sometimes called the horse parlor because when it was bad weather, the horse owners would bring their horses into the men's smoking cabin. So many of the men would be having their cigarette or their cigar, and there would be a big horse standing right next to them. And it was not uncommon to be sitting on a camp chair in the smoking cabin because there were not benches and such installed. You'd be sitting on a camp chair, and you'd be sitting alongside a group of horses who were doing their thing right next to you. Another thing about the Northfield that I like to point out is that they used to keep wooden chain boxes on either side of the ferry. This way, when it listed, the crew or even the passengers would move the weighted boxes around the ship to keep it from listing to one side or the other. So things were kind of loose, as you could tell on the ferry boats back in the old days. In any event, June 14th, 1901, just after leaving the Whitehall terminal, the Northfield is slammed by a boat called the March Chunk. It's a steel-hulled ferry boat that runs for the Central Railroad of New Jersey. It was rush hour, so the Northfield was packed. Within 15 minutes, the Northfield sank. Fortunately, most of the passengers were transferred to the 20 or so tugboats that pulled up alongside where the sinking ship was going down. So most of the people were saved. The number of lives saved is actually estimated between 800 and 1,000. There were at least 4 individuals who were reported dead and missing. And in the long run, they believe 5 people were killed in that mishap. But that's really sad. But for animal lovers like me, it's even sadder when I note that there were 12 teams of horses that were chained to wagons that went down with the Northfield. Let's get off that. Now, the Northfield was actually operated by the B&O Railroad, and it had the right to be in the slip at Whitehall that it was in. But the Central Jersey Railroad decided they were going to tell the March Chunk, you go use that slip as well, because, there's no reason they can't share it with us. They wanted their boat, their March Chunk, to be coming into that slip because right there was all kinds of transportation. There was horse carriages, horses for rent, all kinds of things that were beneficial to the passengers getting off the March Chunk. Unfortunately, the two boats collided. Well, the people of Staten Island lost their minds. They were so upset with the B&O Railroad for running these old boats and the dirty boats and the breaking down boats, and they screamed and they yelled until finally they were able to get the city of New York to take over ferry service from Staten Island to Manhattan. And hence, we got a new class of boats called the Borough class of boats. And it really did make the people of Staten Island very, very, very happy. Now, you might wonder why ferry boats are orange, or you might not wonder why ferry boats are orange. But one of the reasons was that when the ferries were first taken over by the city of New York, they were usually painted white. That Borough class, it was painted white, and a couple of years later they were painted green. And then there was a discussion about how can you see ferry boats when it's snowing or a blizzard or rain or fog? And they decided to paint the boats red. But then they weren't pleased with that, so they did a major study, they being, the Maritime Department of the City of New York. They did a major study, and they decided that Orange was the best color for ferry boats to be painted so that other ships could see them in bad weather. So you see with the Kennedy class of boats, and even a little bit before that, you see ferry boats being painted orange. This would be about the late 1950s, 1960 or so. And ironically, orange, the blue, and some white, you have the colors of the city of New York. So, speaking of Staten Island ferries, fog blanketed the New York harbor on December 12, 1911. This ferry boat Richmond was coming into St. George, and ferry boat Castleton slammed right into her. There were 800 to 900 passengers on the Richmond at that time. And actually that same fog caused the Brooklyn, not the Brooklyn that was in the Borough class of boats, but the Brooklyn that was running on the Hamilton Avenue line between Brooklyn and Staten Island, was also caught up in this fog and actually was lost. This Brooklyn ferry boat actually took 3 hours and 20 minutes to find the slip that it was trying to find. It was terrible. Of the event, the New York Times said, quote, "The circles made off the battery by the Brooklyn ferry boat were very entertaining to the skippers of the towboats and other river craft who were trying to dodge the ferry boat as she swung around. And the maneuvering was just becoming interesting when it was suddenly interrupted by the Brooklyn grounding on a rock off Governor's Island." Oh, the poor captain of the Brooklyn. One ferry supervisor was so bold as to joke that the passengers would not be charged extra for their tour of the New York harbor. Also, it is a scary fact that when cars were allowed on ferry boats, there were times when the cars actually drove off the boats. There was another Brooklyn to Staten Island ferry boat known as the John English. On September 9th, 1922, an automobile driven by Lieutenant Richard Mangles took a forward lurch as he was parked at the edge of the boat, that side that was facing the water. The sudden lurch sent the lieutenant and his friend, who was also sitting in the passenger seat, to go right through the windshield and into the water. Meanwhile, the lieutenant's 2 kids and wife were seated in the back. His wife, Adelaide Mangles, was able to push the 2 kids out the windows. And by this time, the car is actually in the water, and they couldn't save Mrs. Mangles. And they realized they couldn't save her because she couldn't get out. She had all kinds of pots and pans and broiler pans and things like that in her lap. They had rented a cottage at Oakwood Beach for the summer, and they had emptied all the contents of the cottage into the car, and she was trapped by all of these various items from the cottage. Telling you. The Dongan Hills, another ferry boat that went into service in the 1920s, took a serious hit on November 29th, 1930. It was slammed by a Norwegian tanker called the Torres. Again, it was all in a bank of fog. The Dongan Hills received a 6-foot pie-shaped wound in its metal-banded wooden bow. The Torrens suffered only a little bit of a dent. Another hit was taken by the Dongan Hills, this one on February 8th, 1958. It was around 8:11 p.m. when it collided with a British tanker called the Tynefield. The Tynefield was headed for St. George. 30 crewmen and passengers were on the Dongan Hills at the time of the crash. It seems that they had just entered the wind-swept, choppy waters off of Robbins Reef. And just another one of these crazy things that happens. The Gold Star Mother was involved in a crash with a boat called the American Veteran, a vessel owned by the United States Lines. This was on January 15th, 1953. The 2 ships collided off of Governor's Island. There were 19 1,400 people on the ferry boat. 13 sustained injury. Again, another dense fog. Interesting story about the American Legion ferry boat. There was a passenger on board, and his name was Irving Rothman, and he was standing on the prow of the boat in preparation for disembarking at Whitehall. It was only about 7:30 in the morning, November 7th, 1978, and Rothman realized he had left his off-track betting pick card behind at the seat where he had been sitting on. And he said, oh my, I gotta go back to get it. And exactly when he got back to get his pick card, that is when the ferry boat slammed into the tip of Battery Park. Passengers were sent flying throughout the boat. There's a reason they have those signs, don't stand on the stairs when the boat is coming in. So those people who were on the prow, who were attempting to be the first ones to get off the boat in Manhattan, were harmed the most. 9 were hospitalized. 144 were treated and released at area hospitals. 98 were tended to at the scene of the crash. Neither the boat nor Battery Park fared very well at all. The bow of the American Legion was curled back like a sardine can, while the promenade area of Battery Park buckled up as much as a foot. A 50-foot fissure line ran through the shoreline walkway of the park. One journalist stated, "It looks as if an earthquake had hit on Battery Park." The American Legion was actually off course. It was 700 feet to the west of the Whitehall terminal. The captain, Irving Sattler, who was the pilot of the American Legion that morning, stated that the dense fog interfered with his judgment, even though they were navigating with radar. Sattler stated quite plainly, quote, "Everything is the responsibility of the captain." Now, ferry workers, they've taken a lot of heat over the years for various things. On this occasion, it was noted how the actions of the ferry boat workers really helped the people on board the ship. Quote, "Ferry deckhands spread their arms, braced their legs to hold the passengers from pitching into the water at the moment of impact. No one fell overboard." It was later determined that the captain had exercised poor judgment and that the radar system was unable to act in the face of the impending crisis. The Miss New York, as we know, set sail in 1938, and she had a long and honorable career as a Staten Island ferry boat. Like many other ferry boats, she took a hit or two over the years. While traversing the harbor in the midst of an odd summer fog again, on August 30th, 1940, the Miss New York and the 9,500-ton tanker, the Magnolia, actually collided. 6 individuals were hurt, and this took place halfway between St. George and Manhattan. 5 years later, the Miss New York would be hit again, this time by the British freighter that was called the Destiny. This was near Governor's Island. There was minor damage to the boat, but 1 passenger was hurt quite badly. 5 others were taken to downtown hospital for a treatment of hysteria. Spring 1981 saw an incident involving the American Legion. May 6th, 1981, the Norwegian freighter Ho Orchard collided with the ferry boat during a morning rush hour to Manhattan. 60 people were hurt during this incident, and a hole was made in the bow of the ferry terminal. Numerous windows were broken. Interestingly, there was a woman by the name of Christine Russo of Great Kills, and she was on that boat when it crashed. But she was also on the American Legion for another crash in 1978, and she was quoted as saying that she would be very careful about which boats she got onto or the next time she boarded a Staten Island ferry. You may recall the Verrazano ferry boat. It was the sister ship to the private first class Joseph F. Merrill and the Cornelius Kalf. Well, it collided off of Liberty Island with the Norwegian freighter Norlindo on January 20th, 1954. Again, fog. 7 people were injured, while many other passengers were showered with with broken glass and splintering glass. January 19th, 1953, we have a turn of events here. The private first class Joseph F. Merrill actually collided and drove into the ferry boat Ellis Island. And this was only 2 days after the Gold Star Mother collided with a vessel known as the American Veteran. And again, so many of these accidents occurred in the conditions of severe fog. And it might lead us to think that the Staten Island ferry boat is a very dangerous boat, but it's really not. I mean, first of all, we could say that in the last few years, we really haven't heard of any accidents on the Staten Island ferry. But you also have to remember that before the 1950s, there were many, many more ships in the New York harbor, besides the ferry boats. I mean, there were, cargo ships were coming and going, oil tankers were coming and going. A lot of products that were manufactured in the New York City area were coming and going, and raw materials and things like this. And if you look at old lithographs of the New York harbor, old postcards of the New York Harbor, you see there is so much more activity than there is today. So, as I said, there have been a number of accidents years ago on the Staten Island ferry. So, let's get off the ferry now. What do you think? Okay, sounds good. Let me tell you about the Mohawk. It was July 20th, 1876, when wealthy mill owner William Garner and his wife Mary, along with a party of 5 guests, boarded the Mohawk at the Stapleton Yacht Club. They were going to go out and enjoy a few hours of sailing. They were accompanied by the ship's crew, which included Captain Rowland, a steward, 2 cooks, and a number of mates. At this time, believe it or not, the Mohawk was the largest yacht active at that time. William Garner was wealthy. He owned several mills at various locations throughout New York State. There was even a town called Garnersville where one of his main mills was located, and this Garnersville was near Nyack, New York. He also had mills in Rochester, New York, Cohoes, New York, and there were some of the most successful mills in the entire United States. Garner was also the vice commodore of the New York Yacht Club. Now, they're in the Mohawk, the wife is on the boat, they have friends on the boat. Mrs. Garner's brother, with the most interesting name of Frost Thorn, is on the boat. And they just start to take off, when all of a sudden, other boats in the area notice that there are black clouds developing in the south. And it was very apparent to the people who were on the other boats that a dangerous squall was building. They began to pull in their sails while making preparations to land because of this squall that was developing. But on the Mohawk, nobody was doing anything. Nobody was taking down the sails. Nobody was taking the boat back to land. So to the surprise of everybody, the Mohawk kept their sails spread, which was not a good thing, because with the wind that was expected to come in, it would be broadside to the wind, and it could cause the boat to capsize. Onlookers were astonished. One captain even took one of his mates and sent him out on a little rowboat to go tell the captain of the Mohawk that this storm was coming in. Before the guy in the rowboat could reach the Mohawk, the squall came storming into the harbor. The wind hit the Mohawk and it capsized. Eventually, the dead weight of the canvas sails dragged the yacht under the water. There were some onlookers who claimed that Captain Rowland was shouting, save me," instead of telling one of the mates to cut the sails loose. Meanwhile, William Garner, the owner of the ferry boat, he headed for the hatchway because he wanted to tend to his wife and the other ladies that were on the lower deck. At the exact same time that he was heading down into the hatchway, a huge volume of water crashed down the hatchway, and it flooded the cabin, and it actually drowned Mr. Gardner and his wife. When Mrs. Garner's body was found, divers found that it couldn't be moved because there was heavy furniture in the cabin that had moved and trapped and pushed her up against one of the walls of the cabin. So she was not only probably going to drown anyway, but she was so pinned in place by this heavy furniture, she couldn't have escaped anyway. Miss Adele Hunter was also drowned, as was a cabin boy from New Brighton whose name was Peter Sullivan. Mrs. Garner's brother, Frost Thorne, was actually missing. The investigation into the boat's capsize and the deaths of the 5 individuals was begun by Coroner Dempsey in the New Brighton Village Hall on July 22nd, 1876. By order of Coroner Dempsey, the captain was placed under arrest. It was widely reported that Garner could have saved himself, but drowned as a result of trying to save his wife. The ship's master, Captain Rowland, stated that if the furniture had been secured, no one would have died. The jury found no evidence, though, of criminal negligence with respect to Captain Rowland's conduct, and he was released. But when the yacht was righted, it was claimed that Rowland had lied at the investigation, so he was rearrested again. Eventually, Rowland was held blameless, and he actually spent the remainder of his life once he retired, he spent the remainder of his life here at Sailor's Snug Harbor, where he passed away on August 14th, 1903. According to the New York Tribune, Captain Rowland, quote, was always more or less a wreck after the accident. He went to his grave declaring he was not to blame for the sinking of the Mohawk or for the deaths of the Garners. Mr. and Mrs. Garner were buried in Greenwood Cemetery, as was Frost Thorne, Mrs. Garner's brother. One of the Garner houses still stands today, and I know you know this house. It's an interesting house with an interesting history. It was once offered to President Ulysses Grant to live in as a summer home while he was president. But his wife, Julia, when they visited the house, she was appalled at the number of mosquitoes that were on Staten Island and around the house. So they said, thank you, but no thank you for that house. Eventually, it became the St. Austin School for boys, and then St. Austin's Military Academy. It's a Second Empire building, and it's one of the few freestanding pre-Civil War houses in New York City today. In 1903, the house was taken over by St. Vincent's Hospital. You know the house today because it stands on Castleton Avenue on the Rumsey campus in West New Brighton. We're going to close with this incident that occurred on June 2nd, 1973. And one of the most fascinating things about this incident is I had never heard of it. I mean, I was only 13 years old at the time. I was told about it by somebody I just happened to be having a conversation with. And whenever I talk about it with other people, they have never heard of it either. Okay, it was June 2nd, 1973, and a steering failure on the container ship Sea Witch caused it to just, lose control and slam into a ship called the Esso Brussels. The Esso Brussels was actually an oil tanker owned by the Exxon Company. So the resulting explosion that occurred under the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge was causing the flames to come up under and even over the bridge in some instances. And the people in the cars, as you can imagine, they panicked. And some just they were either speeding off to try and figure, to get away from these flames, or it was said that people actually abandoned their cars and then ran back towards Staten Island. Whatever the case may be, picture it. You're on the bridge. There's two boats under the bridge that are, they've exploded. There's flames. I mean, what a horror story. The bridge was, of course, closed for several hours while firefighters battled the flames. Meanwhile, the two ships are just floundering around, drifting around in the lower bay. The ship's captain died from this incident, but because he had a heart attack from the whole thing. The Coast Guard eventually investigated the crash of the Sea Witch and the Esso Brussels. They even made a film of their investigation, so that they could show it to Coast Guard people so that they could learn from it. There's live news coverage in this film. They show the aftermath. They show diagrams of the bridge and the underdecks of the boats and what happened and how it happened. It's just the most interesting thing I've probably ever seen in my life. So I just want to direct you to the film. If you go to youtube.com and you just put in Sea Witch and Esso Brussels into the search box, it will bring this film up so that you could see it and learn further about this particular collision. So I just want to say, thanks for joining us. I also want to let you know that if you go to noblemaritime.org/now, capital NOW, you can see this film and a number of other films that have been put together by the Noble Maritime Collection staff. Thanks so much.